This 1763 map outlines British territories. After the 7 Years' War, Britain became a superpower, ruling massive North American expanses. But financing this conquest ballooned the national debt. Interest consumed half their spending, and defending borders required an expensive military. For a century, the American colonies managed their affairs in a state of salutary neglect. Suddenly, London decided these colonies needed to help foot the bill for their frontier defense. British Prime Minister George Grenville viewed new colonial taxes as a simple accounting fix. He failed to anticipate that forcing revenue measures on a population accustomed to generations of autonomy would ignite a rebellion. The colonists rejected the financial burden, focusing their outrage on the principle of consent. They argued that because they held no seats in Parliament, drawing revenue from them directly violated their rights under the British Constitution. Protests rapidly moved from polite assemblies to physical violence. Tax collectors were beaten, royal governors were hanged in effigy, and in Boston Harbor, a fortune in East India Company tea was destroyed by local patriots. By early 1776, an explosive pamphlet titled Common Sense began circulating. It questioned the foundation of hereditary monarchy, persuading thousands of ordinary people that severing ties with the crown was their only viable option. The ideological divide had already bled into open warfare. Patriot militias had exchanged point-blank volleys with British regulars at Lexington and Concord, and inflicted massive casualties on the king's troops defending the heights of Bunker Hill. King George III refused to hear any petitions for peace. Instead, he ordered the largest expeditionary force in his nation's history across the Atlantic to crush the uprising. What started as a dispute over import duties had reached a point of no return. The colonies were now locked in a war of survival against the wealthiest military on Earth. This document, approved July 4, 1776, declared the formation of the United States of America. But for the 56 signers, this parchment was a collective death warrant. If they failed, this list of grievances would be entered as legal evidence of treason against the crown. Just as these words were being printed, General William Howe arrived off the coast of New York with an overwhelming response: 400 ships carrying 32,000 professional soldiers. Howe's troops were trained British regulars and Hessian mercenaries, backed by naval artillery. Facing them was George Washington's Continental Army, an ill-equipped, heavily outgunned force, plagued by typhus and dysentery. Proclaiming liberty in Philadelphia offered no protection in New York. The political philosophy of independence required a military apparatus capable of withstanding a professional campaign, and Washington's army was severely outmatched. The tactical reality emerged at the Battle of Long Island. Howe swung troops through a hidden pass, outflanking and routing American lines. Washington barely escaped across the East River. For months, he orchestrated an agonizing retreat, abandoning New York and bleeding territory across New Jersey. The Continental Army was disintegrating. Constant defeat and rampant disease triggered mass desertions. By December, Washington's summer peak of 20,000 troops had evaporated to fewer than 6,000 men, with most of their enlistments set to expire in weeks. The remaining forces lacked winter uniforms, proper shelter, and rations. They marched through freezing mud, leaving trails of blood from bare feet in the snow. With morale shattered and the ranks dissolving into the winter landscape, the rebellion was mathematically bankrupt. The British command suspended operations, assuming the American experiment would collapse before spring. Washington understood that continuing to retreat meant the death of his army. To keep the revolution alive, he needed to abandon defensive survival and execute a high-risk offensive strike. He targeted a garrison of 1,400 Hessian soldiers quartered in Trenton, New Jersey, but getting to them required crossing the Delaware River on Christmas night. The logistics of the plan were irrational. It demanded ferrying 2,400 men, their horses, and heavy artillery across 300 yards of ice-choked water in complete darkness, while a severe nor'easter battered them with hail and snow. Yet that exact weather provided Washington's only advantage. The extreme conditions convinced the Hessian commanders that no attack was possible, leading them to drop their guard. Absolute despair left Washington with one path: a strike so risky it effectively bypassed the enemy's defensive logic. The morning strike was violent and fast. Approaching Trenton shortly after dawn, the Americans poured artillery fire into the streets and charged with bayonets, overwhelming the Hessian forces and capturing 900 prisoners in under an hour. Days later, Washington pressed his advantage at Princeton. He personally rode to the front lines, rallying his breaking troops under heavy fire and ending the streak of British victories. The news reached colonies where loyalty to the crown had begun to look like the only path to safety. Recruitment surged, and veteran soldiers who had been packing for home signed back on for another month of service. This survival signaled to the royal courts of France and Spain that the American rebellion was a military force worth backing. The American identity took its first shape in the winter of 1776, defined by a refusal to dissolve when the mathematics of war dictated total defeat.